In 1941, Soviet scientists opened a 500-year-old tomb in Samarkand against the warnings carved into its lid. Legend said the man buried inside had cursed anyone who dared disturb him, promising to unleash a war worse than anything he himself had caused. 2 days later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. 27 million Soviets would die in the 4 years that followed. The man in that tomb had once caused a comparable catastrophe alone, not a king's son, not born to command. A shepherd's boy from a minor clan, lame in one leg from an arrow, his right arm partially crippled. And yet by the time he died, he had built an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edge of China, and left behind a body count estimated at 17 million people, 1 in 20 humans alive on Earth. His name was Timur. History remembers him as Tamerlane, Timur the Lame. He captured a sultan and reportedly kept him in a cage. He built towers out of tens of thousands of skulls outside the cities that resisted him. He also built Samarkand into one of the most breathtaking cities on the planet, an architectural legacy that would inspire the builders of the Taj Mahal a century later. And then he died, and the empire he'd spent 35 years drowning the world in blood to build didn't just weaken, it came apart almost overnight. Why did an empire that terrifying collapse that fast? The answer says more about Timur's one fatal blind spot than about anything his enemies ever managed to do to him. In 1336, in the dusty steppelands of Transoxiana, a region we now call Uzbekistan, a boy was born into the Barlas tribe, a Turco-Mongol clan that had settled into the ruins of Genghis Khan's shattered empire more than a century earlier. His name was Timur. He was not a prince. He was not descended from Genghis Khan, the one bloodline that, in the eyes of the steppe world, carried the divine right to rule as Great Khan. This single fact would shape every decision of his life. By the time Timur was a young man, the once unstoppable Mongol Empire had fractured into quarreling khanates, each one a shadow of what Genghis Khan had built. Central Asia, in the mid-1300s, was a chaotic patchwork of warring tribes, opportunistic warlords, and collapsing authority. It was, in other words, the perfect environment for an ambitious outsider with nothing to lose. Timur started small. Some accounts describe him as a sheep rustler, others as a mercenary soldier for hire, selling his blade to whichever local strongman would pay. It was during these lawless years that he received the wound that would define how history remembers him. Whether from an arrow in battle or a shepherd's arrow while stealing livestock, accounts differ, but the result was permanent: a crippled right leg and a damaged right hand. His enemies mocked him with a nickname meant to humiliate: Timur-Lang, Timur the Lame. Europeans would later twist this into Tamerlane. He wore the insult as an accident of history that could not stop what came next. What set Timur apart from every other steppe warlord scrambling for scraps of power was his obsessive study of the greatest conqueror who ever lived. He could not claim Genghis Khan's blood, so he claimed his methods, devouring the Mongol leader's strategies of speed, deception, and calculated terror. And where blood failed him, marriage succeeded. Timur wed into the Chinggisid royal line, earning himself the title Gurkhan, son-in-law of the great Khan's house. It gave him just enough legitimacy to rally the tribes. He also understood something Genghis Khan never needed: the power of religious legitimacy. Timur cast himself as a champion of Islam, the sword of Islam, a defender of the faith waging holy war, even as his armies slaughtered fellow Muslims by the tens of thousands. It was propaganda, brutally effective propaganda, and it worked. By 1370, through a combination of ruthless battlefield cunning, opportunistic alliances, and the elimination of rivals, Timur seized control of Transoxiana. He was 34 years old, crippled in body, without royal blood, and about to become the most feared conqueror on the planet. Consider the world Timur was born into. 100 years earlier, the Mongol Empire had been the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Korea to Hungary. But empires built on the personality of one extraordinary man tend not to outlive him, a lesson Timur absorbed as a student of history without realizing he was about to become its next, most spectacular illustration. By the 1330s, that Mongol colossus had split into 4 rival khanates, each ruled by descendants who spent more energy fighting each other than governing. Transoxiana, wedged between the fading Chagatai Khanate to the east and the Persian territories to the south, had become a lawless frontier where local strongmen, called amirs, carved out fiefdoms and fought endless petty wars for dominance. It was into this power vacuum that Timur inserted himself with patient, calculating ambition. Unlike many of his rivals who fought for immediate plunder, Timur played a longer game. He formed a partnership with another regional strongman, Amir Hussein, and together the two men spent the 1360s building a coalition strong enough to challenge every other claimant to power in the region. It was a partnership built entirely on convenience, and like most of Timur's alliances, it was destined to end in betrayal. Once Hussein had served his purpose, helping Timur eliminate the region's other rivals, Timur turned on him. Hussein was defeated and killed, and every soldier, tribal leader, and religious authority in Transoxiana understood the message with perfect clarity. Loyalty to Timur was temporary protection, not friendship. In April of 1370, at a formal assembly, Timur was declared sovereign ruler of Transoxiana. He never claimed the title of Khan itself. That honor, by steppe tradition, still required Genghis Khan's bloodline. Instead, he ruled as Emir, officially governing in the name of a series of powerless puppet Khans he kept as figureheads, while wielding every ounce of real authority himself. It was a masterstroke of political theatre, absolute power, wrapped in the appearance of legitimate tradition. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it explains so much of what Timur would spend the rest of his life doing. Denied the one title that would have granted him unquestioned legitimacy across the steppe world, he set out instead to earn something arguably more powerful, a reputation so overwhelming, so soaked in dread, that questions of bloodline would simply become irrelevant in the face of raw, demonstrated power. Every campaign that followed, every city reduced to rubble, every tower of skulls razed along a trade route, served this same underlying purpose, manufacturing a legitimacy that his birth had denied him. In a world that measured the right to rule by ancestry, Timur decided he would measure it instead by fear. And by the time he was finished, kings from Delhi to Cairo to Ankara understood that his claim to power needed no bloodline to back it up. It is also worth remembering that Timur came of age during a period when the entire concept of legitimate rule across Central Asia was already in flux. The old certainties of Genghisid succession, once unquestioned, had been steadily eroding for generations as regional strongmen learned that raw military capability could substitute for pedigree if applied with enough consistency and force. Timur did not invent this dynamic. He simply mastered it more completely and applied it more relentlessly across a wider territory than anyone who came before him. What made Timur different from every warlord before him was not just his army, it was his understanding that fear could be manufactured, engineered, and deployed as a weapon more efficient than any sword. Before Timur's forces reached a city, his messengers went first, and with them came a system so chillingly simple it needed no translation across languages or cultures. A white flag raised over his camp meant submission would be met with mercy. Pay tribute, open your gates, and your people would live. A red flag meant something had changed. Submit now, but every adult male would be executed. A black flag was the final stage. A black flag meant the city, and everyone inside it, no longer existed by sunset. Word of this ritual spread faster than his armies could march. Entire cities surrendered before Timur's forces even arrived, terrified into compliance by the reputation of what came before them. This was warfare as psychology. Timur understood that a single city, butchered as an example, could save him the cost of besieging 10 others. His military machine borrowed heavily from the Mongol playbook, a decimal command structure organizing soldiers into units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, each with absolute accountability up the chain. But Timur layered onto this a discipline even stricter than Genghis Khan had enforced, and an intelligence network of spies and informants that stretched across trade routes from China to the Mediterranean, feeding him information before his enemies even knew he was coming. Marriage remained his other great weapon. Alliance by alliance, Timur wove himself into the fabric of Central Asian nobility, gathering titles, loyalty, and legitimacy the way other conquerors gathered territory. By the time his early campaigns to unify Central Asia were complete, he commanded not just an army, but a machine of calculated cruelty, engineered so that the mere approach of his banners could break a city's will before a single arrow was loosed. The intelligence network Timur built deserves special attention because it is often overshadowed by the horror of what came after it. Merchants, pilgrims, dervishes, and traveling scholars, anyone who moved freely along the trade routes of Central Asia could be recruited as informants, feeding Timur details on the wealth, defenses, internal politics, and morale of any city he might one day target. By the time his armies appeared on the horizon, Timur frequently already knew which factions inside a city favored surrender, which local nobles could be bribed, and exactly where the walls were weakest. Conquest for Timur began long before the first soldier drew a sword. His military discipline was equally calculated. Soldiers who fled the battlefield faced execution. Commanders who failed to meet their quotas, whether of captured territory or, later in his campaigns, of enemy heads, faced the same fate as the enemies they failed to properly punish. This total, merciless internal discipline meant that Timur's armies moved and struck with a coordination that most of his medieval rivals, reliant on loosely bound feudal levies, simply could not match. It was this combination, psychological warfare abroad, absolute discipline within, that transformed a regional warlord's private army into the most feared military force of the 14th century. Consider how differently this system played out compared to a conventional medieval siege. A typical siege in this era could drag on for months or even years, draining the resources of the attacking army as much as the defenders, with no guarantee of success at the end of it. Timur's white-red-black flag system inverted this entire economic calculation of warfare. Because so many cities capitulated the moment his banners appeared on the horizon, entire campaigns that might have taken a rival commander a decade to complete could be accomplished by Timur in a single fighting season. The terror was not simply cruelty for its own sake. Although cruelty for its own sake was certainly part of his temperament, it was, first and foremost, a devastatingly efficient military strategy, one that let a single army conquer a landmass stretching across 3 continents within the span of one very long human lifetime. Modern military historians studying Timur's campaigns often note how strikingly this system anticipated concepts that would not be formally articulated in Western military theory for another 5 centuries. The idea that an enemy's will to resist could be broken through demonstrated capability and reputation alone, sometimes without a shot fired. Timur, working entirely from experience and instinct, rather than any written doctrine, had arrived at the same conclusion through pure practical trial across dozens of campaigns. With Central Asia subdued, Timur turned his gaze toward the wealthy, fractured lands of Persia. The Persian territories were ripe for the taking, divided among competing dynasties, none strong enough to resist a unified invader, and rich enough in trade and culture to be worth the trouble. The siege of Herat marked the beginning. The city fell, and with it began a practice that would come to define Timur's campaigns: the systematic decapitation of the defeated, their skulls stacked into towers as both a monument and a warning to the next city down the road. But nowhere would this practice reach its full, horrifying scale until Isfahan. In 1387, the city initially submitted to Timur's forces and agreed to pay tribute, but when his tax collectors arrived to extract the promised wealth, the citizens of Isfahan rose up and killed them. It was an act of desperate defiance. and it was answered with an act of annihilation. Timur's response was engineered with bureaucratic precision. Each soldier in his army was ordered to bring back a minimum quota of human heads, or face execution themselves. What followed was one of the deadliest single massacres of the medieval world. Historical accounts describe 28 separate towers built from the skulls of Isfahan's population, more than 70,000 heads in total, cemented together as monuments visible for miles. Yet even amid this devastation, Timur's contradictions emerged. As his armies slaughtered soldiers and rebels, he simultaneously ordered the evacuation of Persia's finest scholars, architects, and craftsmen back to his capital at Samarkand. He was building an empire of terror with one hand and an empire of culture with the other, extracting Persia's brightest minds the way other conquerors extracted gold. By the campaign's end, the Muzaffarid dynasty that had ruled central Persia was crushed, and the region belonged to Timur. The Isfahan massacre is worth pausing on, because it illustrates something essential about how Timur's terror machine actually functioned. This was not chaotic bloodlust. Contemporary chroniclers describe an almost administrative horror. Officers moved through the ruined streets, tallying heads like tax collectors tallying coin, and soldiers who came up short on their assigned quota reportedly resorted to buying heads from other soldiers who had exceeded theirs, simply to avoid punishment. The towers themselves were constructed with grim architectural intention, skulls cemented together in geometric patterns, positioned deliberately along roads and city gates, so that merchants, travelers, and messengers would carry news of what they had seen to every corner of the region. Terror, for Timur, was not a byproduct of war. It was infrastructure, built to outlast the campaign itself and do the conquering for him in every city that had not yet been visited. At the same time, the wagons rolling back towards Samarkand carried a very different cargo. Master tile workers pulled from Isfahan's famous mosques, mathematicians and astronomers from Persia's intellectual centers, calligraphers whose manuscripts would later grace the libraries of Timur's own court. Persia in the late 14th century was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated centers of art, science, and philosophy on earth. And Timur understood precisely what he was stealing. He was not merely conquering territory. He was harvesting an entire civilization's accumulated genius and transplanting it, forcibly, into the soil of his own capital. It's a pattern historians describe as cultural transplantation through conquest, and Timur practiced it with a consistency that separates him from most of history's purely destructive warlords. Genghis Khan, by contrast, had largely been content to extract tribute and leave conquered cities to govern themselves under Mongol overlordship. Timur wanted more than tribute. He wanted the accumulated knowledge, artistry, and craftsmanship of every civilization he touched, physically relocated to serve the glory of his own capital. This meant that even as Persia bled from the wounds of the Isfahan massacre, the seeds of what would later be called the Timurid Renaissance were already being planted 600 miles away in Samarkand, carried there in the same caravans that hauled away Persia's plundered wealth. Destruction and creation, in Timur's world, were never separate processes. They were two halves of a single, ruthlessly efficient machine. The scale of forced relocation from Persia alone is difficult to overstate. Some estimates drawn from period chronicles suggest tens of thousands of skilled craftsmen, along with their families, were uprooted from Isfahan, Shiraz, and other Persian cultural centers over the course of just a few years, permanently altering the demographic and artistic character of Samarkand, while leaving Persia's own great cities measurably poorer in skilled labor for a generation or more afterward. To the north lay another Mongol successor state, the Golden Horde, ruling over the vast steppe stretching into what is now Russia. Its leader, Toktamish, had actually risen to power with Timur's own backing. Timur had once sheltered him, financed him, and helped install him on the Golden Horde's throne. Gratitude did not last. Once secure in power, Toktamish turned on his former patron, launching raids into Timur's territory and challenging him for dominance over the lucrative trade routes of the steppe. It was betrayal on the grandest scale, and Timur would not forgive it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in medieval history. Timur led his army on a punishing pursuit deep into the open steppe, chasing Toktamish across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain where supply lines meant nothing and survival depended entirely on discipline and endurance. The two forces finally clashed at the Conqueror River in 1391, a battle involving more than 200,000 combined soldiers, one of the largest engagements the medieval world had ever seen. Toktamish was defeated, but not destroyed, and he would rise again for a second confrontation. That reckoning came at the Terek River in 1395, where Timur crushed the Golden Horde's forces decisively, ending Toktamish's power for good. Timur then marched on Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital, and burned it to the ground. The destruction of Sarai did more than eliminate a rival. It permanently crippled the Golden Horde's ability to dominate the trade routes and territories of Eastern Europe. In the vacuum this left behind, a previously minor principality began to grow in strength and confidence. Its name was Moscow. Timur, without ever setting foot near it, had cleared the path for the rise of the Russian state. It's worth understanding just how strange and audacious this northern campaign was by the standards of medieval warfare. The Eurasian steppe offered no cities to besiege, no rivers to control, no easy supply lines to follow, only endless grassland, punishing weather, and an enemy who could vanish into the horizon at will, exactly the way Mongol armies always had. Timur's ability to sustain a massive army across this terrain, tracking and eventually cornering a mobile steppe force on its own home ground, was a logistical achievement that rivaled anything Genghis Khan himself had accomplished a century and a half earlier. Few commanders in history have successfully hunted a nomadic empire across its own steppe and won. The long-term consequences of Timur's northern war are easy to underestimate, precisely because he never intended them. He fought Toktamish purely over personal betrayal and control of trade wealth. He had no interest in the distant forest principalities of Rus. But by gutting the Golden Horde's military strength and burning its capital, Timur inadvertently removed the single greatest obstacle to the rise of Muscovy. Historians looking back centuries later would trace a direct, if indirect, line from the smoke rising over Sarai in the 1390s to the eventual emergence of the Russian Empire, an extraordinary historical footnote to a war Timur fought purely out of vengeance against a man he once called an ally. The campaign against Toktamish also reveals something important about Timur's psychology that recurs throughout his career. His fury at betrayal by someone he had personally elevated was, if anything, more intense than his fury at ordinary enemies who had never owed him loyalty in the first place. Toktamish had been Timur's protégé, a man he had sheltered as a fugitive and personally financed onto the Golden Horde's throne, expecting in return a compliant ally who would help stabilize the northern steppe. Betrayal by someone raised up through Timur's own patronage seemed to trigger a different, more total category of vengeance than betrayal by a stranger, a pattern that would repeat itself in smaller ways throughout the rest of his reign, and one that his own descendants would learn, too late, applied just as fiercely within his own family. The scale of the Conqueror and Terek River campaigns also deserves recognition simply as feats of military logistics. Sustaining a force of well over 100,000 men, along with their horses, across hundreds of miles of open steppe, with no fixed supply depots required a level of organizational sophistication that few armies in the medieval world, in any region, could have matched. A quieter, less discussed dimension of Timur's genius that made every one of his more famous atrocities logistically possible in the first place. In 1398, Timur turned his ambitions toward the Indian subcontinent, framing the invasion as a holy campaign against a Delhi sultanate he accused of being too tolerant toward its Hindu population, a convenient justification for what was, at its core, a raid for plunder. The march itself was a feat of endurance, crossing the brutal Hindu Kush mountain range in conditions that would have broken lesser armies. What awaited Timur's forces on the plains of India was something they had never before faced in battle: war elephants, armored beasts trained to trample infantry and shatter cavalry charges, a weapon unlike anything in Central Asian or Persian warfare. Timur's solution was as ruthless as it was inventive. He ordered his men to load camels with dry straw, set it ablaze, and drive the panicked, burning animals directly into the advancing line of elephants. The terrified elephants, engulfed in the chaos of fire and smoke, turned and stampeded back through their own ranks, tearing apart the very army they were meant to protect. Before the final assault on Delhi itself, Timur made a decision driven by cold military calculation rather than mercy. Fearing that the tens of thousands of captured Hindu prisoners in his camp might revolt during the coming battle, he ordered them executed, an estimated 100,000 souls killed in a single, calculated act of preemptive slaughter. Delhi fell soon after, and what followed was devastation on a scale the city would need more than a century to recover from. Timur's forces stripped it of wealth, artisans, and its captured war elephants, hauling the plunder back across the mountains to Samarkand. Among the treasures funded by this campaign was the construction of the enormous Bibi Kanim Mosque, one of the era's greatest architectural achievements, built with the blood money of a shattered Indian capital. The Indian campaign lasted less than a year from start to finish, yet its plunder was staggering enough to fund one of the most ambitious building projects of Timur's entire reign. Chroniclers describe caravans of captured elephants, each animal loaded with jewels, gold, and silk, stretching for miles on the return march to Samarkand. 90 captured elephants alone were reportedly assigned the task of hauling quarried stone for the new mosque, animals that only months earlier had been instruments of war against Timur's own forces, now repurposed as beasts of imperial construction. What makes the Delhi campaign particularly revealing is how transparently Timur's religious justification collapsed under scrutiny. He had marched into India proclaiming a holy war against insufficient enforcement of Islamic law, and yet the overwhelming majority of the death and destruction he inflicted fell upon India's own Muslim population living in and around Delhi, alongside the Hindu communities he claimed to be punishing. Religion, once again, proved to be less a motivation than a marketing campaign, a justification crafted for his own troops and for the historical record, layered over what was, in practice, simply the richest plunder raid of his career. The elephant versus fire camel tactic deserves special attention as a case study in Timur's tactical creativity, because it illustrates how he consistently solved unfamiliar battlefield problems through improvisation, rather than rigid adherence to established Mongol or Central Asian doctrine. His army had never before faced war elephants, and conventional cavalry charges, the backbone of steppe warfare for centuries, proved useless against animals that simply trampled through horse formations without slowing down. Rather than retreat or accept heavy losses learning the hard way, Timur's commanders devised the flaming camel countermeasure on the spot, exploiting a simple biological fact. Elephants, for all their size and strength, are instinctively terrified of fire, especially fire that appears to be charging directly toward them, out of control, from an unfamiliar and chaotic source. It worked so completely that later chroniclers described entire elephant divisions turning and trampling their own supporting infantry in blind panic, a single clever improvisation neutralizing what had been, moments earlier, India's most feared weapon of war. The devastation at Delhi also permanently altered the balance of power across northern India for more than a century. The Delhi Sultanate, already weakening before Timur's arrival, never fully recovered its former authority, fracturing into a patchwork of smaller regional sultanates that would remain divided and vulnerable until the arrival, generations later, of Timur's own descendant Babur, who would succeed where the Sultanate's rivals had failed, uniting much of the same territory under an entirely new imperial banner. By 1400, Timur turned his war machine toward the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria. His first major target was Aleppo, and the city's defeat introduced a grim new architectural signature, a tower of skulls rising 20 feet into the air, a monument built specifically to terrify the next city in his path. That next city was Damascus. As the siege unfolded, one of history's most remarkable meetings took place. Ibn Khaldun, the celebrated Arab philosopher and historian, a man whose theories on the rise and fall of civilizations remain studied to this day, was lowered from the city walls by rope to negotiate directly with Timur. Their conversations, recorded by Ibn Khaldun himself, offer one of the only first-hand intellectual portraits we have of the conqueror. A man of surprising curiosity, well-versed in history and geography, engaging the philosopher in extended discussions even as his army waited outside the walls. The negotiations, however, could not save Damascus. Timur had made promises of leniency to secure the city's surrender, promises he broke almost immediately. The Umayyad Mosque, one of the oldest and most significant in the Islamic world, was burned. Mass executions followed. The devastation Timur inflicted on the region went beyond immediate slaughter. His armies systematically destroyed irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture in the Middle East for centuries, crippling the region's economy for generations after his death. And, following the pattern established in Persia, he stripped Damascus of its finest craftsmen and artisans, shipping them back to enrich Samarkand, building his capital's glory on the intellectual and artistic wreckage of every city he destroyed. The meeting with Ibn Khaldun deserves a closer look because it offers something almost nowhere else in Timur's story, a rare, sustained, face-to-face intellectual exchange recorded by an independent, world-class mind. Ibn Khaldun had already developed his famous theories about the cyclical rise and fall of dynasties, how civilizations grow strong through tribal solidarity, flourish, grow soft with luxury, and eventually fall to the next hungry conqueror. Sitting across from Timur, the philosopher was, in effect, meeting a living case study of his own theory in real time, a man of ferocious tribal solidarity who was, at that very moment, ending the cycle of an old civilization to begin his own. Ibn Khaldun would later write extensively about his impressions of Timur, describing him as remarkably intelligent and deeply curious about geography, history, and the workings of distant kingdoms, hardly the crude, illiterate savage that later European accounts often portrayed him as. The two men reportedly spoke for weeks, and yet this intellectual respect did nothing to soften what came next. Within days of the negotiations concluding, Damascus burned, and Ibn Khaldun himself was fortunate to escape the city with his life intact, a sobering reminder that Timur's capacity for genuine intellectual engagement never once overruled his capacity for calculated brutality. The destruction of Middle Eastern irrigation infrastructure is often underappreciated as one of the most consequential, if least dramatic aspects of Timur's entire military career. Unlike a burning mosque or a tower of skulls, a ruined canal system produces no immediate spectacle, but its effects compound silently across generations. Agricultural regions that had sustained dense populations for 1,000 years under Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic rule saw their productive capacity collapse for centuries after Timur's armies moved through. Some historians argue that this long-term economic devastation, rather than any single massacre, represents Timur's most lasting and damaging impact on the region, an invisible wound that outlived every visible monument of terror he left behind, quietly reshaping the economic geography of the Middle East, long after his name had faded from active memory in the region he had shattered. The Mamluk Sultanate itself, though it survived Timur's invasion, never fully regained the regional dominance it had held before his campaign. Weakened militarily and economically, it would spend the following century contending with rising pressure from the Ottoman Empire, eventually falling to Ottoman conquest in 1517, a slow-motion consequence of the damage Timur's brief but catastrophic Levant campaign had inflicted more than a century earlier. The intellectual cost of the Damascus campaign also rippled outward in ways beyond the immediate loss of craftsmen. Libraries and centers of learning that had made the city one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world suffered significant losses during the sack, with manuscripts destroyed or scattered that historians believe can never be fully accounted for, a quieter but no less permanent form of destruction than the burned mosque or the executed scholars. Timur's final great rival emerged not from the steppe or from Persia, but from the rising power of Anatolia. Sultan Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire, nicknamed the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns. Here, for the first time, Timur faced an opponent whose reputation for ferocity rivaled his own. What began as tension escalated into a war of words. The two rulers exchanged increasingly insulting letters, each questioning the other's legitimacy and courage, a diplomatic contest of egos that made outright war inevitable. The armies met at Ankara in 1402, in a battle that would decide the balance of power across the entire region. Timur's forces, ever attentive to logistics, cut off and poisoned the water sources the Ottoman army depended on, weakening Bayezid's men before the fighting even began. Then Timur's agents worked their most devastating weapon, bribery. Turkic vassal troops within Bayezid's own army, feeling little loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan, defected mid-battle, turning against the very force they were meant to support. The result was a catastrophic Ottoman defeat. Bayezid himself was captured alive, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a ruler of his stature. Legends grew quickly around his captivity, including the enduring, though historically disputed, image of the Sultan being carried in a golden cage as Timur's prisoner. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. The Ottoman defeat threw the empire into a decade-long civil war among Bayezid's sons, a period of chaos that historians believe delayed the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople by as much as 50 years, meaning the Byzantine Empire, already in its twilight, survived half a century longer than it likely would have, entirely as a side effect of Timur's ambition. Consider the historical irony sitting at the center of this episode. In distant Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor and the leaders of Western Christendom watched the Battle of Ankara with a mixture of astonishment and relief. Just years earlier, Bayezid's Ottoman armies had been tightening a suffocating blockade around Constantinople itself, and European crusader forces sent to break that siege had already suffered a crushing defeat at Nicopolis in 1396. Constantinople's fall seemed, to many observers at the time, to be only a matter of months away. Then Timur, a conqueror with no interest whatsoever in defending Christendom, arrived from the depths of Central Asia and dismantled the very army that had been on the verge of finishing the job. Bayezid never recovered from his captivity. Historical accounts, though embellished over the centuries by both Ottoman and European chroniclers eager to add drama to the tale, generally agree that the once mighty Sultan died within roughly 8 months of his capture, reportedly by his own hand, unable to endure the humiliation of his reversal of fortune. Timur, for his part, showed little further interest in the Ottoman heartland itself. Having broken his rival and extracted his tribute, he turned his army back east, leaving the Ottoman succession crisis to burn itself out, a masterclass in achieving maximum strategic disruption with minimum long-term occupation. It is worth reflecting on how differently world history might have unfolded had Timur chosen to press his advantage after Ankara. Constantinople, in 1402, lay essentially undefended against any serious military force, its Byzantine garrison a shadow of its former strength, its walls maintained, but its treasury exhausted. Had Timur turned his victorious army toward the Bosphorus, instead of back toward Central Asia, historians have long speculated that the ancient Byzantine capital might have fallen 50 years earlier than it eventually did under the Ottomans in 1453, under an entirely different conqueror, with entirely different consequences for the religious and political map of Europe and the Middle East. But Timur's ambitions, as vast as they were, always pointed east and south, toward the old heartlands of Mongol and Persian civilization that had shaped his worldview. Constantinople, for all its wealth and symbolic importance, simply never registered as a priority worth the detour. This underscores something important about how Timur understood empire itself. Unlike the Ottomans, who saw Anatolia and the Balkans as the natural core of their expanding state, Timur's entire worldview remained rooted in the older imperial geography of the Mongol and Persianate world: Samarkand, Herat, Tabriz, Baghdad. Europe, for all practical purposes, simply did not exist within his strategic imagination as territory worth ruling directly, only as a distant curiosity, occasionally worth a diplomatic exchange. Nothing captures the contradiction of Timur's character more than what he built at home while destroying everything abroad. Here was a man who orchestrated some of the largest massacres in medieval history, and yet poured extraordinary resources, energy, and personal passion into transforming Samarkand into one of the most beautiful cities on the Silk Road. Every conquered city paid a tribute Timur valued above gold: its craftsmen, architects, engineers, tile workers, and artists were forcibly relocated from Persia, India, and the Levant to Samarkand, compelled to build the capital of an empire founded on their own city's ashes. What emerged was a distinctive architectural style now known as Timurid: soaring bulbous domes, intricate blue and turquoise tilework covering entire facades, monumental gateways designed to overwhelm visitors with scale and color. This style would echo forward through the centuries, directly influencing later masterpieces, including the Taj Mahal, built generations later by Timur's own descendants. Timur's system of governance blended the Mongol legal code known as the Yasa with Islamic Sharia law, creating a hybrid framework that let him rule as both steppe conqueror and Islamic sovereign simultaneously. Economically, his empire thrived by controlling and taxing the Silk Road's trade routes, funneling the wealth of continents through Samarkand's markets, while extracting plunder from every campaign. Around his capital, Timur commissioned vast gardens, elaborate green spaces he reportedly considered paradise made manifest on earth, a striking image from a man whose name, everywhere else, was synonymous with towers of human skulls. Visitors to Samarkand during Timur's reign, including foreign ambassadors sent from as far away as the courts of Castile in Spain, left behind accounts describing a city that seemed almost impossible in its opulence: streets lined with silk awnings for royal processions, gardens irrigated by elaborate canal systems, and markets overflowing with goods drawn from every conquered territory between the Mediterranean and the Himalayas. One Spanish envoy, Ruy González de Clavijo, travelled for years to reach Timur's court and recorded his impressions in a detailed diary, describing a capital whose grandeur rivaled anything he had seen in Europe. This is the paradox at the very heart of Timur's legacy, and it is a paradox he seems to have felt no need to resolve. The same mind that calculated exactly how many severed heads it would take to break a city's will also commissioned tile workers to spend years perfecting a single archway's geometric pattern. He understood beauty as another form of power, a way of proving to the world, and perhaps to himself, that the empire built from conquest could also produce something that would outlast the memory of the blood spilled to fund it. In this at least he partially succeeded. Centuries after his campaigns of terror faded into historical footnotes, the architecture of Samarkand remains one of the most breathtaking achievements of the medieval Islamic world. The Bibi Kanim Mosque, funded by the plunder of Delhi, offers perhaps the clearest window into Timur's approach to construction: relentless, almost tyrannical urgency applied to art the same way it had been applied to conquest. Chronicles describe Timur personally overseeing the mosque's construction in his final years, reportedly dissatisfied with the pace of the work and having sections rebuilt when they failed to meet his exacting standards, even hurling coins to workers from horseback to speed their labor along. The scale of the project, a central dome that was, at the time, among the largest ever attempted in Islamic architecture, pushed the engineering limits of the era so aggressively that portions of the structure began showing signs of structural strain within Timur's own lifetime. It was, in a strange way, the perfect metaphor for the entire Timurid project, audacious beyond precedent, built with overwhelming force and urgency, magnificent to behold, and already showing cracks in its foundation before its creator had even left the scene. Clavijo's diary, one of the richest surviving foreign accounts of Timur's court, also describes elaborate court ceremonies involving feasting that could last for days, ritualized gift exchanges with foreign dignitaries, and a genuine cosmopolitanism at court, with merchants, scholars, and envoys from China, India, and Europe all present simultaneously, a snapshot of Samarkand functioning, at its height, as one of the true crossroads of the medieval world. Even in old age, Timur's ambitions had no ceiling. His final and most audacious plan was an invasion of Ming China, framed as revenge for old grievances tied to the broader Mongol world's historical rivalries with Chinese dynasties. In the winter of 1404, Timur assembled his largest army yet, more than 200,000 soldiers, and set out toward China. It was a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. He chose to march during one of the harshest winters Central Asia had seen in years, pushing his aging body and his massive army through brutal cold that even his hardened troops struggled to endure. Timur himself, now approaching 70 years old, had been suffering from declining health for some time, plagued by illnesses that biographers still debate the exact nature of. The winter march accelerated his decline. On February 18, 1405, in the town of Otrar, in what is now Kazakhstan, Timur died. His inner circle understood the danger immediately. An empire built entirely around the personal terror and charisma of one man could shatter the instant news of his death spread through the ranks. Commanders moved swiftly to conceal his passing, controlling information as tightly as Timur himself once controlled the fate of conquered cities. His body was smuggled back to Samarkand in secrecy and interred at the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum, the same tomb that Soviet archaeologists would crack open 5 centuries later, setting in motion the eerie coincidence of June 1941. There is something almost mythic about the symmetry of Timur's final campaign. Here was a man in his late 60s, his body already broken by decades of old wounds, choosing to launch the single most logistically demanding invasion of his entire career, a war against the largest, wealthiest, most populous empire on the planet, during the coldest months of the year, across terrain that had already claimed the lives of countless smaller expeditions. It was the decision of a man who had never once in his life been forced to accept a limit, testing that record against the one enemy that never negotiates: time itself. Contemporary accounts describe the final weeks of Timur's life as marked by fevers and severe pain, though modern historians have offered various theories ranging from pneumonia to complications from old age and old injuries finally catching up with a body pushed far beyond reasonable limits. Whatever the precise cause, the great conqueror who had decided the fate of millions across 3 continents ultimately died the same way every human being does, quietly, in a military camp, far from the glittering capital he had spent a lifetime building. The planned China campaign is one of history's great what-if scenarios, precisely because it never actually happened. The Ming dynasty, under the formidable Yongle Emperor, was at the height of its power in the early 15th century, commanding vast armies, a sophisticated administrative bureaucracy, and resources on a scale that dwarfed anything Timur had faced in Persia, India, or the Middle East. Some historians argue Timur's campaign, had he lived to launch it, might have finally met an opponent capable of matching his own military machine on equal terms. Others point out that the same qualities that made Timur so devastating against fractured, internally divided kingdoms, speed, psychological terror, exploitation of political division, might have simply not worked against a unified, centrally administered Chinese state, with its own long tradition of dealing with steppe invaders. We will never know. Timur's death in the snows near Otrar, closed the book on what might have been the most consequential military confrontation of the entire 15th century before a single battle was ever fought. Interestingly, the Yongle Emperor himself reportedly took the threat of a Timurid invasion seriously enough to reinforce China's western frontier defenses in the years leading up to Timur's planned campaign, aware of his reputation even from thousands of miles away. News of Timur's death, when it eventually reached the Ming court, was said to have been received with considerable relief among Chinese officials who had been bracing for a war against the most feared military commander of their era. The secrecy surrounding his death also extended to how the campaign's massive assembled army was handled in the immediate aftermath. Rather than risk the political chaos of announcing the death to 200,000 armed men still gathered for an invasion, commanders quietly began dispersing units back toward their home territories under various pretexts, diffusing what could otherwise have become an uncontrollable armed mass with no clear leadership, adrift deep in Central Asia during the harshest months of winter. Timur's greatest political failure was not a mistake on the battlefield. It was a mistake of planning. Despite ruling for decades, he never clearly established an unambiguous line of succession, leaving behind a tangle of competing claims among his sons and grandsons. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Almost before his body reached Samarkand, factions loyal to different heirs began tearing the empire apart from within. Among the most destructive figures was his grandson Khalil Sultan, who seized control of Samarkand itself, and then, according to court chronicles, squandered the imperial treasury on lavish indulgences driven by his infatuation with a woman at court, hemorrhaging the wealth Timur had spent a lifetime plundering. With the center paralyzed by infighting, the empire's outer provinces saw their opportunity. Regions across Persia and the Middle East, held together only by fear of Timur's personal reputation, began breaking away, falling back under the control of resurgent Ottoman power and various Turkic tribal confederations. This is the moment that reveals the fatal flaw at the heart of Timur's entire system. His empire's terror-based strategy worked brilliantly when Timur himself stood at the center of it, but it possessed no mechanism to function without him. His soldiers, his governors, his allied nobles had all sworn loyalty to Timur the man, not to any lasting institution of the state. The moment the man was gone, the loyalty evaporated with him, and the empire began tearing itself apart along the exact fracture lines his terror had always concealed. Compare this to how other great empires managed succession. Rome developed, however imperfectly, systems of adopted heirs and institutional continuity that could survive a bad or short-lived emperor. The Ottoman Empire, despite its own brutal fratricidal succession struggles, at least maintained a single ruling dynasty and administrative bureaucracy that persisted across the chaos. Timur built none of this. He built a court, an army, and a network of loyal vassals that answered to his personality, his reputation, and the fear he personally inspired. An entirely non-transferable form of political capital. Every governor he had installed across a dozen conquered territories had been chosen for personal loyalty to Timur specifically, not for any commitment to a Timurid state as an abstract ongoing institution. Within just a few short years of his death, the empire that had once stretched from Delhi to Damascus, from the Caucasus to the borders of China, had fractured into competing regional fiefdoms, each ruled by a different grandson or general, each claiming legitimate inheritance, none strong enough to reunite what their grandfather had built with sword and terror alone. There's a particularly telling detail buried in the chronicles of this succession crisis. Several of the very same commanders who had served Timur with unwavering loyalty for decades, men who had marched with him across the Hindu Kush and stood beside him at Ankara, switched allegiances between rival claimants with startling speed once the old conqueror was gone. This wasn't necessarily cynicism or opportunism in the way modern readers might assume. In the political culture of the steppe and Persian world, personal loyalty to a specific leader, rather than abstract loyalty to an office or institution, was simply how power had always worked. Timur had built the most extreme, most successful version of this personality-driven system the region had ever seen. Its collapse upon his death was not a betrayal of the system's logic. It was that logic, finally, inevitably, playing itself out to its natural conclusion. Contemporary chroniclers writing in the years immediately following Timur's death describe a genuine sense of shock among the empire's subject populations at how quickly the machinery of centralized control simply stopped functioning. Provincial governors who had ruled with an iron hand under Timur's watchful, terrifying reputation suddenly found their authority openly challenged by local elites who, only months earlier, would never have dared such defiance. Even Timur's own funeral procession back to Samarkand, conducted in secrecy to prevent panic among the ranks, foreshadowed the chaos to come. Rival commanders escorting different portions of the imperial baggage train and treasury reportedly began positioning their own forces for advantage even before the body reached its final resting place, a grim preview of the naked scramble for power that would consume the empire within weeks of the funeral rites being completed. From the chaos of succession, one of Timur's sons eventually emerged victorious, Shah Rukh, his fourth son, who consolidated power and ruled from 1409 to 1447, a reign that would prove to be the empire's last extended period of stability. Shah Rukh made a symbolic and strategic choice early in his rule, relocating the imperial capital from Samarkand to Herat, in what is now Afghanistan. It was more than a change of address. It reflected a fundamental shift in the empire's entire philosophy of governance. Where Timur had built his reign on relentless conquest, Shah Rukh pursued something almost unrecognizable in comparison: diplomacy, cultural investment, and stability over expansion. He cultivated formal relations with Ming China and other neighboring powers, favoring trade and negotiation over the sword. Under his patronage, Persian miniature painting and poetry flourished as never before, producing some of the most celebrated artistic works of the Islamic world's golden age. It was this cultural investment, more than any military campaign, that preserved Timurid civilization's legacy for future centuries. But this shift came with a cost that later chroniclers debated fiercely. Was Shah Rukh's gentleness a wise correction to his father's excesses, or was it a double-edged sword for an empire that had been built, brick by brick, on conquest and fear? An empire forged by the sword, some argued, could not survive by abandoning it, and the softness of this golden interlude may have only delayed, rather than prevented, the empire's eventual unraveling. It is worth noting just how remarkable Shah Rukh's 40-year reign actually was, given the chaos that both preceded and followed it. He managed to reunify most of the core Timurid territories, Persia, Transoxiana, and Afghanistan, through a careful mixture of military pressure against the weakest rivals and generous diplomacy toward the strongest ones, a very different toolkit from his father's approach of overwhelming force applied indiscriminately everywhere. Herat, under his patronage, became one of the great intellectual capitals of the Islamic world, drawing scholars, poets, and artists from across the region, comparable in cultural output to Florence during the same era in Italy. Yet the underlying structural weakness identified in the previous episode never actually disappeared during Shah Rukh's reign. It was merely papered over by his personal skill as a ruler and diplomat. The empire still depended entirely on the capabilities of whichever individual sat on the throne, with no durable bureaucratic or institutional framework strong enough to survive a weak or incompetent successor. Shah Rukh had bought the Timurid dynasty 40 more years of relative stability. He had not solved the fundamental problem his father left behind. Shah Rukh's approach to religion and legitimacy also marked a notable departure from his father's. Where Timur had used Islam largely as a tool of military mobilization and propaganda, invoking holy war even against fellow Muslims when convenient, Shah Rukh cultivated a far more genuine reputation as a pious and just Islamic ruler, patronizing religious scholars, funding mosque construction and restoration across his territories, and generally governing with an eye toward moral legitimacy rather than pure fear. This shift helped stabilize his rule domestically, earning him a degree of popular and religious support that his father, for all his military triumphs, had rarely bothered to cultivate. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the son of the man who built towers from 70,000 skulls became remembered in many corners of the Islamic world as one of the more just and moderate rulers of his era. Herat under Shah Rukh's wife, Gur-e-Amir, herself an extraordinary patron of architecture and learning, saw the construction of some of the era's most celebrated religious and educational buildings, cementing the city's reputation as a rival to Samarkand itself in cultural prestige, proof that the Timurid Golden Age was, in this generation at least, shaped as much by remarkable women at court as by the men who held formal political titles. It is this period, more than any other in Timurid history, that later generations of historians in Central Asia would point to as proof that the dynasty's true legacy lay not in Timur's own campaigns of terror, but in the 2 generations of relative peace, learning, and artistic achievement that followed him. A golden age built, however precariously, on the foundations his conquests had laid. Among Timur's most remarkable descendants was his grandson Ulugh Beg, who governed Samarkand and left behind a legacy entirely unlike his grandfather's, not one of conquest, but of science. Ulugh Beg constructed what was, for its era, the most advanced astronomical observatory on the planet, a massive structure in Samarkand dedicated to precisely charting the movements of stars and planets. His court produced groundbreaking mathematical and astronomical texts, calculations of such precision that European scholars would still be studying and relying on them centuries later. But brilliance in the observatory did not translate into strength on the battlefield or in the court. Ulugh Beg proved a weak military leader, and his intellectual pursuits, particularly his embrace of scientific inquiry, drew growing hostility from conservative religious officials who viewed his priorities as a betrayal of proper Islamic rule. The story ends in tragedy that reads like something from ancient legend rather than 15th century history. In 1449, Ulugh Beg was murdered, assassinated on the orders of his own son, Abd al-Latif, in a brutal act of patricide driven by the same hunger for power that had fractured the dynasty for generations. The murder of a scholar king by his own child marked, in many ways, the symbolic extinguishing of the Timurid Golden Age, the family consuming itself from within, exactly as it had once consumed the cities of Persia, India, and the Levant. The observatory Ulugh Beg built deserves to be remembered as one of the true scientific marvels of the pre-modern world. Its centerpiece was an enormous curved sextant, partially built underground, so precisely engineered that it allowed his team of astronomers to calculate the length of the solar year with an error of less than 1 minute compared to modern measurements. An astonishing feat of precision, achieved without telescopes, centuries before their invention. His star catalogue, cataloguing over 1,000 celestial bodies with painstaking accuracy, was later translated and used by European astronomers well into the following centuries, quietly shaping the foundations of the scientific revolution that would eventually reshape the Western world. And yet none of this scientific brilliance could protect him. Religious conservatives at court viewed his devotion to astronomy, mathematics, and what some considered borderline heretical inquiry into the nature of the heavens as a dangerous departure from proper rule. When his own son turned against him, citing these very grievances as justification, Ulugh Beg's murder was framed by his enemies not merely as a political coup, but as a righteous correction, a chilling illustration of how the same court culture that could produce a genius astronomer could just as easily produce his executioner from within his own bloodline. Ulugh Beg's scientific legacy would ultimately outlive his political failures by centuries. His astronomical tables, known by their Persian name, were copied, translated, and studied from the workshops of Samarkand all the way to the observatories of early modern Europe, cited by astronomers working long after the Timurid dynasty itself had vanished from the map. There is a real, if indirect, scholarly lineage connecting Ulugh Beg's 15th century observatory in Samarkand to the later work of European astronomers who helped lay the groundwork for the scientific revolution. It stands as perhaps the single most enduring, least bloody contribution any Timurid ruler made to world history, a strange, quiet counterpoint to the towers of skulls his great-grandfather had built 2 generations earlier, proof that this dynasty's legacy could not be reduced to conquest alone, even if conquest was almost always how the story began. Modern astronomers still occasionally reference Ulugh Beg's remarkably precise measurements when discussing the history of observational astronomy, and a lunar crater bears his name today, a small permanent marker on the surface of the moon itself, honoring a ruler whose own kingdom on Earth proved far less durable than the calculations he left behind. Centuries later, Timur's story would collide with one of the 20th century's greatest catastrophes in a way that still unsettles historians and skeptics alike. In 1941, under direct orders from Joseph Stalin, Soviet scientists launched a secret project, opening the sealed tomb of Timur at the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum in Samarkand. The mission was led by Mikhail Gerasimov, a pioneering Soviet anthropologist who had developed groundbreaking techniques for reconstructing a person's facial appearance directly from their skull. What Gerasimov's examination confirmed was remarkable in its own right. Physical evidence in the skeleton verified centuries-old written accounts that Timur had indeed suffered a crippled left leg and damage to his right arm, the very injuries that had earned him his mocking nickname generations before. But local legends surrounding the tomb told a darker story. Inscriptions at the site were said to carry a warning that whoever disturbed Timur's rest would unleash an enemy more terrible than he himself had been, and local accounts describe elders warning the Soviet team against opening the grave at all. The team proceeded anyway. On June 22, 1941, mere hours by some accounts after the tomb was opened, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in military history, tearing into the Soviet Union along a front stretching thousands of miles. The story took one more strange turn in 1942. Timur's remains were reburied according to proper Islamic funeral rites, on Stalin's orders, and almost immediately afterward, Soviet forces achieved their decisive turning point victory at the Battle of Stalingrad. Historians overwhelmingly treat this as coincidence, a case of pattern-seeking minds connecting unrelated events after the fact. But the story persists precisely because the timing is so eerily, undeniably exact. Skeptics point out entirely reasonable explanations for the timeline. Nazi Germany's invasion plans for Operation Barbarossa had been in detailed preparation for many months before June 1941, with a launch date set well in advance for reasons entirely unrelated to a tomb opening in Soviet Central Asia. The precise timing of the tomb's opening relative to the invasion's launch has also been disputed and re-examined by later historians, with some accounts suggesting a gap of days rather than mere hours, and the reburial to Stalingrad connection in 1942 ignores the vastly more significant military, industrial, and strategic factors that actually determined the outcome of that titanic battle. And yet the legend endures, retold in documentaries, books, and now podcasts, exactly like this one, precisely because it captures something irresistible about how we process history. The desire to find pattern and meaning in events that were, in reality, shaped by economics, logistics, and human decision-making, rather than curses reaching across 5 centuries. Whether coincidence or something stranger, the story of the 1941 tomb opening remains one of the most talked-about footnotes in the entire saga of Timur, proof that even in death, this man's legend refused to stay buried quietly. Beyond the curse legend itself, the 1941 excavation holds genuine historical and scientific significance that tends to get overshadowed by the more sensational story. Gerasimov's facial reconstruction technique, developed and refined through years of forensic and archaeological work, allowed him to produce what is widely considered one of the most accurate likenesses ever created of a historical figure from skeletal remains alone. A face that, for the first time in over 5 centuries, let historians and the public alike look directly at what Timur actually looked like, rather than relying on the stylized, often wildly inconsistent portraits found in Persian and Central Asian manuscripts. The reconstruction confirmed a broad-shouldered, powerfully built man whose injuries, exactly as ancient chroniclers had described, left him with a pronounced limp and a stiffened right arm, physical evidence bridging 500 years of legend and written record into a single, startlingly concrete scientific confirmation. The wartime context surrounding the excavation adds another layer worth understanding. Stalin's government had commissioned the project partly for genuine scientific and archaeological purposes, and partly as a piece of nationalist propaganda intended to celebrate Central Asia's historical greatness under Soviet stewardship. An irony given that Timur's own conquests had left much of the Soviet Union's Central Asian territories devastated centuries earlier. When Operation Barbarossa erupted just days after the tomb was reopened, the coincidence spread rapidly through word of mouth among Uzbek and Central Asian communities, several of whom reportedly urged Soviet officials to rebury the remains immediately to lift what they believed was an active curse. That reburial, delayed by wartime chaos, would not actually take place until late 1942, arriving, as the legend tells it, just as the tide of the war began to turn decisively against Germany at Stalingrad. Following the golden interludes of Shah Rukh and Ulugh Beg, the Timurid dynasty entered a period of irreversible decline. New powers rose from every direction to claim what remained of Timur's once vast territory. From the north came the Uzbek tribal confederation, known as the Shaybanids, pressing steadily into Timurid lands. From the west, a new Persian power emerged, the Safavid Empire, led by the charismatic young Shah Ismail, who would go on to reshape the political and religious landscape of Persia for centuries. Compounding these military pressures was a structural economic shift, far beyond anyone's control. European explorers had begun charting sea routes that bypassed the overland Silk Road entirely, gradually eroding the trade wealth that had financed Timurid power for generations. Without Timur's constant campaigns of plunder to replenish the treasury, and without full control of the trade routes that once funded everything, the dynasty simply lacked the financial resources to sustain its armies. One by one, the great Timurid cities fell. Samarkand and Herat, the twin jewels of the empire, passed into the hands of rival powers in the early years of the 16th century. By 1507, barely a century after Timur's death, the Timurid Empire had been completely erased from the political map, a strikingly rapid collapse for an empire that had once stretched from India to Anatolia. The rise of the Uzbek Shaybanids, led by the formidable Muhammad Shaybani Khan, proved to be the decisive military blow the fractured Timurid princes simply could not withstand. Where Timur's descendants had spent decades fighting one another over ever-shrinking pieces of the original empire, the Shaybanids arrived unified, disciplined, and hungry for territory in a way that echoed Timur's own rise more than a century earlier. A bitter historical irony. The conquerors of the conquerors, following almost the exact same playbook their victim's ancestor had once written. Simultaneously, in Persia, the rise of Shah Ismail and the Safavid dynasty introduced a further complication: religious realignment. Ismail aggressively promoted Shia Islam as the state religion, sharply distinguishing his new empire from the largely Sunni orientation of the fading Timurid territories and the rising Ottoman Empire alike, reshaping the religious map of the entire region for centuries to come. Caught between an aggressive new power rising from the steppe and an aggressive new power rising from Persia, the last scattered Timurid princelings simply had nowhere left to retreat. The broader economic story unfolding in the background of this final collapse deserves its own attention because it represents a shift in world history far larger than any single dynasty's fate. Throughout Timur's lifetime, and for decades afterward, the Silk Road remained the primary artery connecting Europe and East Asia, and control over its trade routes was the foundation of Timurid wealth and power. But by the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers were pioneering sea routes around the southern tip of Africa, directly to India and beyond, routes that would soon make the overland caravan trade increasingly obsolete. The Timurid princes fighting over the fragments of their grandfather's empire had no way of knowing that the entire economic foundation their power depended on was already being quietly undermined by ships sailing thousands of miles away. A reminder that even the mightiest land empires of the medieval world were, in the end, at the mercy of economic forces reshaping the planet far beyond any single battlefield. There is also a human dimension to this final collapse that pure political and economic analysis can obscure. For the ordinary people living across the former Timurid territories, the decades of fragmentation meant renewed instability after the relative calm of Shah Rukh's long reign, shifting tax burdens as new rulers claimed the same cities in rapid succession, disrupted trade as caravan routes fell under the control of rival warlords, and the constant low-grade violence of a region without a single, stable center of authority. Chroniclers from the period describe once thriving market towns along the old trade routes gradually emptying out, their populations drifting toward whichever regional power seemed likely to offer the most stability, a slow demographic bleeding that mirrored, on a smaller scale, the exact dynamic that had once allowed Timur himself to rise from the chaos of a collapsing Mongol order a century and a half earlier. History, in this corner of the world, seemed to be repeating its own pattern of collapse and reconstruction almost exactly. The story, however, does not end there. Among the Timurid princes displaced by the empire's collapse was a young man named Babur, Timur's great-great-grandson, who fled Samarkand as a refugee with nothing left to his name. Babur turned his ambitions southward, and through a combination of inherited military tradition and sheer determination, carved out a new empire in northern India. This became the Mughal Empire, one of the most powerful and culturally influential states in world history, carrying forward Timurid artistic and architectural traditions that would eventually produce wonders like the Taj Mahal. Remarkably, this dynasty, born from Timur's bloodline, would survive in some form all the way into the 19th century, outlasting the original Timurid state by more than 300 years. Looking back across the entire arc of this story, a clear pattern emerges. Empires built entirely around the personal ferocity and reputation of a single leader tend to be spectacularly powerful and spectacularly short-lived. The terror that let Timur conquer city after city was inseparable from Timur himself, and without him, it simply had nothing left to hold on to. History's memory of Timur remains split along a fault line that mirrors his own empire's dual nature. In much of the Western world, he is remembered primarily as a monster, a name synonymous with towers of skulls and rivers of blood. In modern Uzbekistan, by contrast, he is celebrated as a national hero, his statues standing where monuments to Lenin once stood, his image on the currency, his name given to streets and squares across the country. Babur's own account of his journey, recorded in one of the most remarkable autobiographies to survive from the pre-modern world, describes years of desperate wandering, temporary conquests won and lost, and repeated attempts to reclaim Samarkand that ultimately failed. It was only after abandoning his ancestral homeland entirely and turning his ambitions toward the rich, fractured kingdoms of northern India that Babur finally found lasting success, defeating the Sultan of Delhi at the pivotal Battle of Panipat in 1526 through skillful use of early gunpowder weapons and field artillery, technology his great-great-grandfather Timur had never possessed. The Mughal Empire that Babur founded would eventually be ruled by his grandson Akbar, one of history's most celebrated administrators, who built a sophisticated, durable bureaucratic state that solved precisely the problem that had doomed the original Timurid Empire, a system of governance that did not depend entirely on the personal terror or charisma of a single ruler to hold together. In this sense, the Mughals succeeded, in India, at building the institutional empire that Timur himself never managed to construct in Central Asia, a strange, delayed vindication carried forward through 5 generations of bloodline and displacement. There is a final layer of irony worth sitting with as this story closes. Babur, forced into exile and humiliation, carried with him not just his great-great-grandfather's bloodline, but a deep cultural memory of Timurid identity, its poetry, its architectural ideals, its Persianate court culture, which he transplanted into India the same way Timur himself had once transplanted Persian craftsmen into Samarkand. The magnificent gardens Babur built in his new Indian territories deliberately echoed the paradise gardens of Samarkand he had been forced to abandon. Generations later, his descendant Shah Jahan would build the Taj Mahal, its soaring dome and intricate tilework drawing directly on the same Timurid architectural language, first perfected under Timur's patronage in the 1390s. In this sense, Timur's cultural legacy achieved something his military empire never could: genuine, multi-century permanence, carried not through conquest and terror, but through art, memory, and inherited aesthetic vision, flowering fully 300 years after the empire that first gave it life had vanished from the map entirely. There is one final thread worth pulling before this story closes: the Mughal Empire's own eventual decline. Centuries later, under pressure from British colonial expansion, followed a strikingly similar arc to the one that doomed the original Timurid state: succession crises, fragmenting central authority, and provincial governors gradually asserting independence as the centre weakened. It is almost as though the family carried, embedded somewhere in its political DNA, across 500 years and two entirely different empires on two different continents. Both the singular genius for conquest that let a low-born Central Asian warlord build an empire from nothing, and the singular vulnerability that made every empire his bloodline, built almost impossible to hold together once the founding generation's personal force of will was no longer there to hold it in place. Two empires, one dynasty, one recurring lesson written twice across 5 centuries of world history. In the end, the story of the Timurid Empire stands as one of history's starkest lessons. Mountains of skulls can win you an empire, but they can never guarantee that your children will be able to keep it.